Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another hobby cheating video. And today we are going to be discussing power swords and non-metallic metal, or highly reflective swords. They're kind of both the same thing. Highly reflective chrome will often play a lot like the same techniques that you want to use on power swords. So let's get into it. What do I have here? Well, first of all, I'm going to narrate this because this is long and it's really the same technique over and over and over and over again. So rather than have you watch me do that slowly and at normal speed, I thought it would be more beneficial to do this. So and it's only taken me 5 times at recording this narration to get it, so I'm excited about that. So let's start at the beginning. What do I have here? Well, I got 6 paints. I go from a very dark gray, a black gray, which is fantasy games from scale 75, Necro Gray. Okay. And I go all the way up to white. I have 2 different whites, a regular liquid pigment white paint from Warcolors, and a white glaze, which is a white I really appreciate because it just lets you very subtly and softly push your whites. What do I have in the middle? Well, in the middle, I've got a very dark jade green, I have an emerald green, and a sky blue. Now, why am I walking through those colors? Well, the answer is because, one, this is a power sword, so it needs to look energetic, and green and blue traditionally look like energy, right? So that's helpful. But 2, in general, even if I weren't doing like a power sword, okay, even if I were doing something else that was just regular steel, if you're doing highly reflective steel, in general, you want to have some blues or some greens or something like that in there because you want to have it reflecting and grabbing the colors of the earth around it. So that is to say the sky or the grass or something like that. Okay? So that's the paints I'm selecting. I happen to like this transition. Let's talk about what I've set up here and what I'm actually doing right now. You see on screen. So I started by doing a quick zenithal highlight, but in a very particular way. I sort of undershaded more than zenithal, and I'm doing a 3-2 transition. So a 3-2 is when you've got 3 hot spots on one side and 2 hot spots on the other. Hot spots are nothing more than where your white spots are. The most important part of this technique with these kinds of power swords or chrome swords or anything highly reflective is that you have to walk from very dark, i.e. my dark gray color, all the way up to very light, usually true white. Okay? And in this case, you want those 2 things to be sort of opposed to each other. What I mean by that is that even though I'm doing this sort of 3-2 situation here, most people usually just run this in what I'll call the 1-to-1, where one side of the blade goes from dark at the bottom to light at the tip, usually the side tilted towards the sky, and the other side goes from light at the bottom to dark at the tip, where, because of the angle, the bottom of it would actually catch the most light. So the key there is that the dark and light are opposed to each other. So step 1 when you do this is simply blocking in your colors, right? And that's what I'm doing here. I started with my mid-tone, and I kind of covered that over my grays. I rebuilt in my whites to make sure they were lined up properly, and then I started building in my darker colors. And you'll notice that I went way, way dark, and then I'm using the mid-tone to back out some of that darkness. Now, why did I do that? Why did I put down the full dark and then put the lighter mid-tone over top of it as opposed to just mixing them? Well, the reason is because when you mix 2 colors, you get a different color. I don't want a different color. I want the effect of an undershade, of the darker color showing through the layer of paint above it. And that's the key. There is a significant difference between what your eye perceives when it's looking at something that's undershaded with lots of layers, where it's being presented with lots of complex visual information, and all of those colors dog-piled together. Okay? So that is to say, there's a difference between when you look at a rainbow and when you look at a white light. right? A white light is all of those 7 colors smashed together, but that's obviously a different effect than looking at a whole rainbow where they're split apart. Similar theory. Okay. So once I blocked in the colors, you notice we jump cut there as we jump from the colors being blocked in to now what we're going to do is we're going to smooth out our transitions. And I'm going to try to build in some extra darks, make sure my lights are nice and sharp, right? And then I'm going to smooth those transitions. So how am I going to do that? By the way, just a quick aside, it's really fun to hold a miniature like this to paint. But this is how I had to hold this crazy thing to get it on camera. So that was awesome. The the way I'm going to achieve that is using kind of every tool in the toolbox. That is to say, I used some glazing on this. I used some wet blending on this. I used some loaded brush. I used some void or spit blending. And the key is when you're really going for these hyper smooth transitions, you're just pushing paint around a lot. So 2 things are very important when you're trying to achieve this kind of a really smooth transition. And this is something I see people ask about how to achieve smooth blends all the time. What I will tell you is try some non-metallic metal, even if you're not doing it for competition like this piece is or something, because it will force you to just push paint around and to slow down and to really work your blends. When people say, you know, how do you get that smooth blend? Well, time is really the first and most important answer. Now, there are shortcuts, okay, and there are tricks, but time is always going to be the most critical element. And really, it's just being unafraid to keep pushing extremely thin layers of the paint back and forth. Thin, thin, thin. So let's talk about how I employ each of these. So when I'm trying to build the transition, or to smooth the transition, I should say. Sorry, smooth the transition between the 2 colors, like what you see me doing here. I'm using mostly glazes. Okay. So I find the 2 colors I'm trying to match between. I mix them on my palette into a very, very thin glaze. What is a glaze? It's just a hyper thinned version of the paint using a large amount of water and or thinner medium glaze medium. And you're looking to only tint. It'll be very wet. When you touch your brush to it, your brush is going to soak a bunch of it up. So it is very important that you then wipe most of it off. You do not want an extremely wet brush when glazing. All that is going to do is slop a bunch of extra paint onto the figure. That is not helpful. You need to get that nice wet mixture onto your brush and then wipe most of it away. And with the remnant, you just do some nice, very light touches in the middle of the 2 colors you're trying to bridge. Okay, so that's how I'm using glazes. I'm using spit blending or void blending to build my extremes. So to build the very darks and to build the very lights. How am I doing that? Or what is spit or void blending? That's where I take a very, again, wet version of the paint, usually with some retardant medium. So some drying retardant. I use a 50-50 mix of retardant medium and water. I keep a drop of that on my palette. I take a little bit of the paint. I mix it with an equal amount of the retardant medium on a wet palette. So it's very wet paint. And again, I put a tiny drop at where I want it to be. So if I'm going for like a dark, I'll put it at the darkest point. Then I go and you can either take the paint off in your mouth, like literally just lick the brush clean, or you can very quickly go into your water, rinse, wipe, back into the mouth to create the point or something, however you remake your point. And then you go back to the miniature, and the drying retardant will give you this extra time. And you take that and you just kind of very slowly drag it up and thin it out. You'll see me do that here with the very high highlights and the very low lows. Okay, so the very deep shades. So that's mainly how I'm void blending. It's called spit blending or void blending because you're voiding the paint. You're removing some of it is the idea, right? You're pulling it very thin, thinning it out, removing some of it from what you just put on the model. Spit because you put it in your mouth to clean your paintbrush. I also use a fair amount of wet blending here. Again, that relies on having some mix of retardant medium. You put a wet form, and I tend to use that again to bridge two colors. If I'm trying to bridge in sort of the darker areas or in the midtones, that's what I mainly am doing here. So it's much the same technique as the void blending, except instead of going back with just a moist brush to kind of remove or spread thin some of the paint, you're going back with a second color and then placing it and then mixing the line between the two when they're both still wet. Nothing too complicated. Both techniques rely on honestly, on a completely similar tactic. The difference is just when your brush goes back to the miniature, does it have paint on it or just water on it? Okay. Finally, loaded brush. You won't see me use that a huge amount here because of the nature of the doing the 3-2. If I was doing a 1-to-1 where I had one side of the sword being completely from light to dark, it would be a much more useful form of blending. Loaded brush is where you load up your paintbrush with a wet mid-tone, and then you take the very, very tip of that brush and you dip just the tip, the tippiest tip, just the tip, tiny tip, into like a white or into a very dark. And then you start at your highest highlight. And as you put pressure on the brush and the wet paint wicks up from the belly into the tip, it then mixes automatically in the brush and creates a very smooth blend. If you want to see more about loaded brush, I would very highly recommend you check out Ben Komitz's video on it as part of the Painting Buddha series. Ben is the originator, as far as I know, of the technique and a master of it. And he is his tutorial on it is great. I also have a tutorial on all these blending forms I'm talking about back in the Hobby Cheating series. I go through all of them and show you how to utilize them in detail. So what I'm doing here is just what I've been describing. I'm just smoothing, investing that time, right? So now let's talk about the final steps here. If you've got your blends all in, the final step to these swords is to add your additional contrast. Here, this sword had a blood channel, so I darkened that because that creates a nice dark line that's recessed that contrasts against the bright whites. But it also has edges, and one of the most important parts of selling the effects of these swords is a nice, clean edge highlight. Because right now you've got the contrast running vertically between dark light. Running these other lines of solid darkness and solid light through those other colors then creates those additional points of contrast that really make the recesses pop. So when you're edge highlighting, as you can see me doing here, what I'm doing is I'm getting some white paint. I'm wiping most of it away, and then I'm lightly with the side of the brush, repeatedly just touching it. I'm not trying to get it all at once. I'll go multiple times. Just light touch. The brush should not be bending at all. The bristle should remain straight. That's how you know you're touching it light enough. And I'm just hitting every edge I can very carefully. The other key with this is you want nice, sharp breakpoints. So like at the tip of the sword, it needs to be a very straight line between light and dark. At each cut and angle of the sword, you want extreme sharp edges. That's what sells the illusion. So there you go. I'm going to have a picture here at the end that shows you the finished product. And hopefully you like how it came out. As I said, you don't need to be this complicated. You don't need to go with all these different transitions. I just wanted to show you sort of the most complicated, so I would have time to walk through and show you it can be done in a very ridiculous fashion through weird colors and all this. So give it a like if you enjoyed this. Share it with somebody if you think they'd be interested. That's always the nicest thing you can do. Subscribe for additional hobby cheating videos in the future, and leave a comment down below of the hobby cheating you'd like to see. I always love to see viewer suggestions. We'll be doing a lot more with non-metallic metal in the months to come and these kinds of effects. Talking about blending and achieving these effects. So hopefully we'll see you next time. Thank you very much, everybody.